So we all need to work together. We need to be friends, not rivals. Well, is that how exactly the lie of the land is going to turn out? We're joined now to discuss this by Professor Stephen Haseler, Director of the Global Policy Institute. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Europe versus the United States. Is Europe a rival or a partner to the United States as we start to develop this more multipolar world?
Well, I think we've got different interests in common. Some interests in common, some interests are different. But we are not completely the same as the United States, and consequently we look at the world differently. And I think, therefore, that you can say, ultimately, Europe is a rival to the United States in certain sections of its economic activity. It's not a rival in terms of its values and all that kind of stuff, but it certainly is a rival economically, in my view, yes. And it will particularly become quite an acute rival as Europe becomes more united and as the United States begins to continue this process of deleveraging, which is going on at the moment.
Europe is already an economic superpower, but many people have described it as a political pygmy. It doesn't have the kind of political infrastructure needed to take part in the world at the same level that the United States does. How do we go about fixing that?
Well, it has one very big bit of integration which is very important for Europe as a global player, and that is the European Central Bank. Now, whatever one thinks of the policies of the European Central Bank, in this crisis we're facing right now, the European Central Bank, in my view, is the major player in the world. I believe we're seeing a process, not just of a power shift that you were talking about earlier from Europe and America to China. I believe we're seeing a change in the reserve currency status of the United States and Europe. The European Central Bank, in my view, has played this crisis we're in more carefully, more judiciously. Admittedly, it hasn't had the huge debt problems that the United States has had to face. But I think that is an area where Europe is strong and integrated and is now becoming a global player. Now, to become a true global player, we now have to add to that by defense and political cooperation, but we're virtually there, in my view, as a continent now.
Even on the economic side of things, though, do you think that we really have the power to rival? Because the author I was talking to a little earlier, or just on those tapes we were watching, Fareed Zakaria, he was talking about how Europe needs to have a bigger population, it needs to have a higher birth rate, and it needs to have more immigration. Is this a economic handicap that we suffer?
Both the Europeans and the Americans suffer economic handicaps. It is an economic handicap. It is a handicap for Europe, but we have one very important thing the Americans don't have. If you look at the continental economies, they don't have the debt levels that the American private sector has, which are enormous and which have caused the present problem around the world. So when you look at the European economy as we come out of this crisis, I believe it will bottom at some point, not yet. The Europeans, in my view, have a more stable economy and an economy which is not based upon this over-leveraging that's gone on, certainly not to the same as the United States. And the reason for that is because it has a social model. It has a capitalist system and a different approach to capitalism, which I believe has been more successful. And on the immigration point, yes, that's something we've got to look at. But nonetheless, I do think that that might be overdone often as an argument, mainly because I think if you look at China, where you say they've got a lot of people, and a lot of people is what you need, well, I'm not so sure you do. I think you need a good balance between people, arable land, water supplies, and all the rest. And I think Europe has a fairly good balance in that respect at the moment.
How does America look at Europe in this whole transition that we've been talking about? Because we listened to some of our colleagues talking across the pond about the challenge of China or the opportunities that there might be in China. And some of the guests mentioned, well, okay, there's already another reserve currency, and that's the euro, and they perhaps look quite disparagingly on that as an idea. Both economically and politically, how do you think that is changing in America?
The Americans have been disparaging Europe for some time. Sclerotic economies, too little population, a whole number of things the Americans have been saying about the European economy, which in my view is just flat wrong. I think what the Europeans have got right is they've got their economy in balance, and you need above all at the moment a balanced economy to weather this storm, and we haven't gone in for the massive debt levels that the Americans, and I'm afraid we in England, have also followed. So I think the time for this kind of criticism from across the pond is over. I think we've now got to look at how to weather this particular storm, and the fact that there are other forms of capitalism that may not be quite as dynamic as the American capitalist system was, but it was that very dynamism and it was that very sort of openness and freedom that led to the deregulation, in my view, which led to the huge leveraging, the problem we've now got. And that's not a problem we're going to face in Europe to the same extent. We're going to face it, but not to the same extent.
What we do have a problem with, though, in Europe is an issue of structural reform. Mm-hmm. We need to create a freer system when it comes to economic development. Germany is at one extreme. You can argue it has made this system, this social model, work for itself in a very effective way. Italy, maybe you could argue, is at the other extreme, and it is not working. How does Europe create a more even balance? How does it bring the worst performers up to speed? How does it therefore create... there's a lot of work that needs to be done internally.
Yes, there is. And one way is, frankly, I've believed this for some time, is through the discipline of the ECB. Now the Italians will have to start dealing with, I mean, one of the problems...
But are the politicians convinced by this?
No, they're not wholly. No, they're not wholly convinced by it, but they're just going to have to be. The fact that the point is that the Italian government needs to stay in the Eurozone. I mean, Italy would go belly up if it came out of the Eurozone. There's no way they can leave, but they're going to have the disciplines imposed on them, particularly on public spending, which can be imposed through the Eurozone. It'll work itself out. It's a difficult situation at the moment, but I'm pretty sure the European economy will be able to work itself out, because ultimately the euro is a strong currency, a hard currency, and is becoming the reserve currency of the West as it transfers from the United States. It's a slow process, but it's happening.
The Lisbon Treaty, dare I mention it, was supposed to be the thing that gave Europe the political integration to match the economic integration. Correct. I know it's not easy to answer this briefly, but do you think it's a shame that we haven't gone down that road? Or, well, we are going, perhaps, but slower.
I think it is a shame, but I think by 2009 we'll be back on track on that in a number of different ways. But there's no question we do need political unity now to cap the economic integration, which is now proving to be relatively successful. No, we do need it, and we'll have to come back to it again.
Professor Stephen Haseler, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.